Support for our town, Morgan County, comes from the Citizens National Bank of McConnellsville, since 1886, working to support individuals, businesses, and charities while striving for economic and personal success in the community. Citizens National Bank, Morgan County's home-owned bank, member FDIC. Morgan County, Ohio, front porch to the great outdoors with rustic cabin hideaways, 30,000 acres of public access land for hunting, fishing, and camping. Events and attractions at visitmorgancountyohio.com. Additional support by the Morgan County Herald, connecting our community since 1844. Ohio Health, where health is an ongoing journey and wellness and sickness are part of a lifelong partnership. Discover your best health at Ohio Health. The Twin City Opera House, a Morgan County cultural landmark since 1892. Morris Hardware, in business since 1845 and operated by the same family for 6 generations in its original storefront in McConnellsville. And by the following.
There's a valley that lies among verdure-crowned hills, and a beautiful river runs through it. This river was home to the most sparkling rills in the days when the first men knew it. And these children of nature gazed into its reach, reflecting the blue of the sky. And they gave it the name in their guttural speech of Muskingum, which means the elk eye. James Ball Naylor.
When the first humans reached the valley, its river had already been shaped by millions of years of geologic turmoil. Creeks once flowed through the valley floor, feeding ancient rivers known as the Tays and the Newark. As glaciers crept south, they dammed the rivers and formed massive lakes. The waters reached the top of an ancient ridge near the Muskingum and Morgan County line and cascaded over the hill into the valley. The waters combined to form a new river. Prehistoric people known as the Adena and Hopewell made their homes along the water's edge for thousands of years. They constructed large mounds to honor their dead and mark their territory. The mound builders abandoned the river around the 6th century, and new tribes soon filled their place. The Wyandot from the north and the Delaware from the east. They named the river Muskingum, meaning elk eye, from the abundance of game along the water's edge. Soon, European explorers entered the valley seeking a fortune in the trade of fur.
It's highly probable that the first white person to ever see the Muskingum River was a Frenchman, what the French called a voyageur. The French claimed everything from Quebec to New Orleans. That was all their land. And then the French and Indian War changed that.
In the 1760s, Britain and France battled for control of the continent. The Wyandot and Delaware joined the French, but were ultimately defeated. After surrender, France ceded the Ohio country to England. In order to calm tensions, the British and Indians agreed that the lands west of the Ohio River, including the Muskingum Valley, would be reserved as Indian land. During the American Revolution, many of the Ohio tribes joined forces with the British against the colonies. When Britain was defeated, the Crown relinquished its claims through the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The Americans felt they now owned the Indian land within the Ohio country through the right of conquest.
Do you know what the Treaty of Paris that made the United States says about the Indians? There's nothing in that treaty that justifies that the British had owned that land and is now giving the Indians land to the United States. All it was giving up is this right to be the first purchaser, which is called a preemption right.
The Indians denounced the American claims on their homeland, and tensions on the frontier escalated. Despite these unresolved legal questions, in 1787 the United States Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, creating the Northwest Territory. Article 3 of the ordinance explicitly stated, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent." Within 2 weeks, Congress began selling Indian land to investors. Chief among them was the Ohio Company of Associates, led by General Rufus Putnam and the Reverend Manasseh Cutler. The company purchased roughly 1 million acres in the Northwest Territory, including the lower Muskingum Valley. In April 1788, Rufus Putnam led a group of New Englanders down the Ohio River and landed at the mouth of the Muskingum. The party was greeted by 70 Delaware, led by Captain Pipe.
Captain Pipe told us that they should be happy to live by us, but did not expect any people would come to settle before a treaty. We told him we had brought no families, nor would any come until after the treaty. Rufus Putnam, May 17th, 1788.
Within 8 months, and before a treaty, 19 families had arrived on the banks of the Muskingum. From this base of operations, known as Marietta, the Ohio Company began surveying and selling the land. In an effort to formally acquire the Indian land they had already sold, Congress authorized Ohio Territorial Governor Arthur St. Clair to make a treaty with the tribes in Marietta. St. Clair insisted that since the Indians fought with the British during the Revolution, their land was now property of the United States.
They simply threatened the Indians. You fought for the British, we now own your land, as if you're a barbarian.
Great Britain asked for peace, and your lands were given to us as part of the price. The United States would have been justified to all the world to have marched their armies into your country and punished you. If you will have war, you may have war. Arthur St. Clair, January 6th, 1789.
Now, does that sound like a free and open negotiation? It's clear the land was extorted, and everybody knew it, but nobody would say it.
Enraged by the loss of their homelands, bands of Indian warriors conducted a series of guerrilla attacks against the pioneers. In an effort to establish a buffer around the major settlements, the Ohio Company commanded a group of pioneers to construct a new outpost upstream from Marietta.
People were scared, but the Ohio Company insisted, we're going to take all this land away from all of you if you don't go up there and protect the approaches to the settlements. So the Indians will hit you and not Waterford, not Wolf Creek Mills, not Marietta. They'll hit you first and then we'll hear about it. And that's exactly what happened.
In the fall of 1790, a group arrived at a large area of bottomland along the river and established the settlement of Big Bottom. In early January of 1791, a party of roughly 24 Delaware and Wyandot took to the warpath, likely headed for the established settlements downriver. When they reached Big Bottom, they discovered the new and vulnerable intruders. The Indians crossed the Muskingum at a riffle in the river and fell upon the pioneers. 12 settlers were killed, including 1 woman and 2 children. 5 men were taken captive. The massacre at Big Bottom reverberated across the frontier. Embarrassed and concerned, Rufus Putnam sent an urgent letter to President George Washington.
Sir, our situation is truly critical. Unless the government speedily sends a body of troops for our protection, We are a ruined people. Rufus Putnam, January 8, 1791.
After years of conflict, President Washington ordered General Anthony Wayne to wage total war against the Indians. Wayne's victory over a confederation of tribes at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the resulting Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forced the Indians from Ohio forever. With the territory cleared, a steady stream of white settlers made their way up the Muskingum and into the wilderness. The pioneers faced a difficult road ahead. The hills around the Muskingum were covered in an endless forest, and every inch of ground they claimed had to be earned by sweat.
And people are always like, oh man, I would love to go back there. I would love to go back. And I'm always like, no, you wouldn't. Because there's no running water, there's no inside plumbing, there's no electricity. You're gonna last about a half a day, and then you're gonna be looking for the train back to the 21st century. It's just not gonna be as cool as you think it is.
So it was a wilderness here. I mean, one of my favorite stories to tell is there were so many trees in Ohio that a squirrel can go from tree to tree all the way to Canada without touching the ground.
In 1816, a small settlement was made on the west bank of the Muskingum, roughly 11 miles north of Big Bottom. The early citizens called it Malta, after the Mediterranean island. A year later, General Robert McConnell, a veteran of the War of 1812, platted another town on the river, opposite Malta.
And he fell in love with this valley. The woods and the animals, this was just almost, for Robert, my understanding was like paradise.
The early residents called the settlement the Old Town, but soon renamed it McConnellsville in honor of the general.
There was a great anecdote about the guy that came up from Marietta, and he's standing in the middle of what is now McConnellsville, and he asked this fellow that he meets, so where is this McConnellsville? And he said, you're in it. Because there was just a path.
In 1817, the Ohio legislature authorized the formation of a new county, which included the Muskingum Valley. It was called Morgan, named for colonial hero General Daniel Morgan.
He was a brilliant commander, took care of the British down in the Carolinas.
Morgan County soon filled with settlers focused on subsistence farming. Along with agriculture, other industries, such as the production of salt, soon emerged.
Morgan County was famous for its salt, and that was not used as table salt. It was used mostly for tanning.
You find a great big iron tub. Salt brine is boiled down and boil the water off, and what's left is what you sell.
Despite the Treaty of Greenville, some Indians remained in the Muskingum Valley, living among the white settlers. While their interactions were relatively friendly, time had not yet healed all wounds. During the Indian Wars, Abel Sherman, a white settler, was ambushed, scalped, and left for dead. His killer was never found.
He was a well-known, well-liked pioneer, and whoever did it took off, and nobody knows who did it.
Decades later, the murder remained unsolved. A lone Indian named Silverheels made his camp at the mouth of Bald Eagle Creek. The settlers and salt boilers were well acquainted with Silverheels and often invited him to share their campfire.
They'd sit around, drink hooch, tell stories. Well, one time they got him intoxicated. And when he was intoxicated, he started bragging about how many white scalps he'd taken. I think the legend is 16 or so over the course of his lifetime, which means he's probably a pretty old fellow. And then he gets to bragging about one in particular that he had taken, and he's sitting around the campfire telling this.
Silverheels claimed he had sold the pioneer's scalp for $50 and hidden the man's rifle in the trunk of a tree.
One of Abel Sherman's sons was one of those sitting around the campfire. Nothing happens, but the son goes back down the Muskingum to where his dad was killed and finds the old tree, finds his dad's rifle in that tree. The next thing we know, Silver Hills has disappeared. Silver Hills is just no more.
Days later, a pair of hunters found the body of Silver Hills lying in his campfire. His final resting place remains a mystery to this day. The riffle in the Muskingum River near Big Bottom, where the Indians crossed before attacking the settlers years earlier, bore Silver Hills' name for generations. But as navigation dams were added to the river, it slipped below the rising waters.
The navigation dams was an early project in the 1800s to make the river navigable for riverboat traffic. And before that, it didn't have the volume of water that it now has.
A series of 11 locks allowed riverboats to transport goods and passengers from Marietta to Dresden. With a navigable river, farmers had a reliable way to get their goods to market, and new settlers migrated up the valley. With these new citizens came new ideas and new ways of life. In 1829, a group of families from Belmont County purchased 100 acres in Marion Township. They called themselves the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers.
Quaker's a Christian denomination, but they don't have ritual or ceremony. Most of them don't have preachers and paid ministers. And it's quiet. I mean, you can speak, but for the most part, it's a meditative worship.
They named their small town Chesterfield after a village in England. In 1838, the name was changed to Chester Hill.
The name was changed to Chester Hill, but the Quakers never did. Our Quaker meeting is still called Chesterfield. Just a little bit of stubborn streak there. Quakers owned everything in Chester Hill. The saying was you could walk from Chester Hill to Bartlett and never get off Quaker land.
Chester Hill was soon filled with stores, merchants, and a bank. But when an outsider attempted to open a saloon, the teetotaling Quakers handled the situation in their own special way.
The Quakers and their fellow townsmen collected a sufficient purse and went in and purchased every drop in stock and store, then rolled it out and emptied it in the drain without tasting a drop of it. Since then, Chester Hill has continued to grow and enjoy a reasonable prosperity without the help of John Barleycorn and his fire water. Miss Minta Hoops.
Key among Quaker tenets is the belief that the light of God resides in all men. In the mid-1850s, the Quakers of Morgan County turned this faith into action. In September of 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. The law required runaway slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had already reached the free northern states. Almost immediately, slave hunters invaded Ohio.
Just didn't make it to freedom. Once you cross the river, it's not all paradise on the other side. There's still things you had to look out for, whether it be racism itself or whether it be to be recaptured and sent back south. So there's still obstacles and terrifying obstacles for that matter to deal with.
I cannot imagine how my ancestors survived the torture that they had to go through to seek freedom.
Before the Fugitive Slave Act was even passed, Northern abolitionists had developed intricate systems to help runaway slaves reach freedom. The network of secret routes and safe houses came to be known as the Underground Railroad. The Quakers in Pennsville and Chester Hill played significant roles as conductors, risking their own safety to help those in need.
They were fortunate enough where I tell people today they have privilege based on their skin tone and based on their family ancestry, so they used that to their advantage to help slaves escape to freedom. They took a stand and they risked a lot to do so.
And if you did, you could be persecuted, lose your property, go to jail. You say, well, why did Quakers break the law? Helping people seek freedom was against the law. But why did Quakers do that? And why did other people do that? It's because They felt like they were doing God's work, and man was breaking the law.
As slave catchers roamed the hills of Morgan County, conductors constantly sought new locations and methods of hiding the runaway slaves.
The pioneers were just geniuses about helping people and figuring out ways to secure their safety. Many times they would hide people in the cave. It's called Hinman Cave. And then at night, they would go and get them and bring them to their homes to stay, where it's a little bit warmer.
Along with Chester Hill, Pennsville, and Stockport, Deavertown was also a major hub. Affadilla Deaver served as a conductor for years, as did the family of Thomas Gray.
I have been called at all hours of the night by a gentle rap at my door. How well I remember that old familiar rap. It was not a sharp, loud, commanding rap, but a low, mellow tap, denoting fear, yet hoping. Thomas Gray.
By the time of emancipation, nearly 300 escaped slaves passed through Morgan County in search of freedom. Some of the African Americans who stayed in Morgan County intermarried with their white neighbors and remnant groups of Native Americans, forming a unique triracial heritage.
My family actually is referred to as triracial. And the reason I use the term people of color is because so many of us identify at different races in this area. You know, I have family members that identify as white, and I have some that identify as Native American. Whites in Appalachia, and I use that term loosely, came here escaping persecution on the East Coast. So those who identify as African American, Native American, we have a lot in common with those people. Sometimes those commonalities can bring us together as well, but we have to know the history first.
As Civil War engulfed the nation, men from all parts of Morgan County joined the fight. Rufus Dawes joined the famed Iron Brigade and saw action in numerous major engagements. His son, Charles Dawes, would later win the Nobel Peace Prize and then served as Vice President of the United States under Calvin Coolidge. Otho Strahl was born in 1831 to a family of former Quakers near Elliott's Crossroads. Raised in Malta, he moved to Tennessee in 1855 to practice law. A total of 6 members of the Strahl family left Morgan County and joined the Union Army. Otho chose the Confederacy. At the urging of many Confederate officers and President Jefferson Davis himself, Strahl was promoted to general. On September 1, 1862, 2 companies of men from Morgan County mustered into Ohio's 97th Infantry in Zanesville. Among them was 19-year-old drummer Thomas Drake, who volunteered to take the place of his older brother, Eden. On November 30, 1864, Thomas and his comrades formed an advance line of battle at Franklin, Tennessee. Across the field were 20,000 Confederates. At precisely 4 p.m., the rebels advanced. Vastly outnumbered, Thomas and his company retreated to the safety of their main line and took up position behind a series of earthworks. The rebels smashed into the center of the Union fortifications. Leading the Confederates in a direct attack on men from his home county was Otho Strahl. As his soldiers climbed the embankment, Strahl crouched below them and reloaded rifles for his men.
I took position with one foot on the bodies of my dead fellows and fired guns which the general himself handed up to me, until he too was shot down. S. A. Cunningham.
As Strahl lay dying, 5 Union soldiers from Morgan County had perished as well, within range of rifles the general himself had loaded. Thomas Drake's drum found its way home to Morgan County, but the young private is buried in an unknown grave under the Tennessee soil. Among the Confederate officers who recommended Strahl be made a general was Braxton Bragg. In 1863, he ordered General John Hunt Morgan to conduct a cavalry raid in Kentucky, but explicitly forbade him to cross the Ohio River into Northern Territory.
But he decided to cross the river anyway and put a little bit of the war up in this area here.
John Hunt Morgan stirred up more excitement than people can even begin to imagine. Here is a Confederate general making it into Northern Territory, deep into Northern Territory, into the state of Ohio.
After his defeat at the Battle of Buffington Island in Meigs County, Morgan and his remaining men turned north and fled through the wilderness of Ohio's hill country, pursued by more than 100,000 Union soldiers. Along their way, the Confederates stole horses and food from local farms. On July 22nd, the riders entered Morgan County and camped on the banks of the Muskingum, opposite Eagleport. Word of the advancing rebels quickly reached McConnellsville, just a few miles downstream.
When the alarm was sounded, it was a state of panic.
On the morning of July 23rd, Morgan's men crossed the Muskingum at Rokeby Locks. A local militia, made up of several hundred young boys and old men, took refuge in the hills and fired upon the Confederate Cavaliers. Under the hail of lead, Morgan's men crossed the Muskingum and took command of the McElhaney farm as bullets ripped through the wooden structure, forcing the home's owners to flee. As Union gunboats and reinforcements made their way down the Muskingum from Zanesville, the Confederates fled north through the hills and valleys. They never did enter McConnellsville. Morgan was eventually captured in Columbiana County and transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus. He escaped the prison and returned to the South, where he was killed in action the following year. Among the men from Morgan County who sacrificed their lives to preserve the Union was Robert Naylor. He left behind his widow Nancy and their 3-year-old son Jim. The Naylors made their home on Newton Ridge, and throughout his time in school, Jim was a notorious class clown. He was often reprimanded for writing satirical poems about his classmates and teachers. After his time at Stockport High School and a brief career as an educator, he took a job in the pharmacy of Dr. Gatewood. From there, he enrolled in Sterling Medical College in Columbus and became Dr. James Ball Naylor. After spending time away, he returned to Morgan County and married Lina Ervilla Naylor. He established a practice as a country doctor in Pennsville and soon relocated to Malta. Naylor traveled across the county on horseback, visiting his patients in their homes and bartering for his services.
And money was scarce, and people paid with chickens and all sorts of different things.
When his mentor, Dr. Gatewood, created a poetry contest, Jim entered. His submission was titled The Muskingum Valley, a composition describing the history and beauty of his home. He was awarded first place, collected a prize of $10, and the poem was published in the Herald, launching a literary career that spanned decades. His first book of verse, Current Coins Picked Up at a Country Railway Station, was published in 1893.
He spent a lot of time and effort putting that together. It was actually the 4 seasons of the year. And so at the beginning of each section, he wrote about what the Muskingum looked like during that particular season.
He wrote under the pen name S.Q. Lopius, an ode to the Roman god of healing. As his fame increased, he changed his signature to J.B. Naylor and then James Ball Naylor. In 1901, he published his first novel, Ralph Marlowe. He modeled his characters off of citizens in Morgan County and set the story in Stockport, which he renamed Babylon. The book sold tens of thousands of copies and remained on the bestsellers list for 6 months.
And that turned out to be a runaway success because he was writing about contemporary America, and people wanted to hear about that. He just hits the mark on so many things that are timeless.
Not content to simply write and practice medicine, Jim soon began reciting his poems at events across the county. Jim and Lena had 6 children, and they soon joined their father on stage for his performances. He was now an accomplished doctor, poet, novelist, and entertainer, but still felt he could achieve more.
He was consumed with politics his whole life. He ran for office a number of times, never succeeded. They called him he with a political coat of many colors because he would run as a Democrat here and run as a Republican here.
Through his time in politics, he became close friends with future United States President Warren G. Harding. Harding, known for offering political appointments to his friends, asked Naylor to work for him in Washington on multiple occasions, but the doctor declined and stayed in Morgan County. After Harding's unexpected death and the revelations of major corruption within his administration, Naylor slipped into a depression.
And when Harding died, Naylor continued to support him, and he ended up getting fired from his different columns because of it. And I'm sure he took the hit in his hometown, too, for being a Harding supporter.
When his daughter Olive's husband left her, Jim and Lena helped raise her twin boys, Winston and Weston. Olive and her sons eventually moved to Hollywood, and the twins found fame on the silver screen where they appeared in the first Our Gang films.
Nice young men from the things that I've read about him. Well, they were, New Year's Eve, they had gone to a party, and there was a flash flood, and the skies just opened up and it washed them all away. And he lost both grandsons and just about killed him. That was his depressed period. And he did come out of it, but he didn't write again. He never wrote any more poetry.
In 1945, while reading one of his favorite poems at home, Naylor suffered a heart attack and passed away.
He was 84 years old. And the praise that he got, if you read his obituaries, was just absolutely incredible. What's important to you in your life? And that's what he had to really think about. He loved being who he was. He loved being a famous writer. But deep down, what was important to him was being a medical doctor and helping people and his family.
When Jim married Lena, he became brother-in-law to her sister Lila. In 1881, she married Charles Morris and joined him during services at the Trinity Methodist Episcopal Church in McConnellsville. Around age 30, Lila began composing hymns to sing during Sunday services. Soon, Lila had composed dozens of hymns, and they began to be published in church hymnals. In 1913, at the age of 51, Lila's eyesight began to fade. Her son created a 28-foot-long blackboard with a large musical staff so she could continue to write. But within a year, she lost her sight completely. Despite her new challenges, she continued composing. Lila is credited with writing more than 1,000 hymns published in hymnals around the world. One of her best-known compositions, Sweeter as the Years Go By, was recorded by blues legend Blind Willie Johnson in 1929, the same year Lila passed away. While Lila was composing, the valley flourished. Steamboats made their way up and down the river, and many industries were established.
Lots of manufacturing, foundries. The big companies were like Brown Manley Plow Company, which became sort of nationally renowned for making this high-quality farm equipment. There was a huge tannery in Malta. Of course, all I can think about was, oh my God, that must have been horrible. Tanning hides is not a pleasant thing. And there are people who have told me stories that, their grandparents or great-grandparents said, yeah, when that plant went away, nobody in Malta was sad because it did reek. You know, my perception of things, at least, is that Malta was really the industrial center, more so than McConnellsville, and McConnellsville was more of a sort of retail and business center.
The river provided transportation and entertainment for the valley's residents. Other times they took to the hills and visited the Devil's Tea Table, a 600-ton sandstone formation high above the Muskingum.
It was quite a picnic area, you might say.
That's where romances were bloomed. And one of the old myths was if a young man would climb to the top and walk backwards 3 times without feeling fear, he could conquer anything he set out to do in the world. I don't know how many men were lost due to this little rhyme, but nevertheless. And if a young lady would chip off a small piece of the Devil's Tea Table and take it home and put it under her pillow and repeat, "A wondrous rock, be true to me, let me this night my lover see," she would go into a deep trance, and that night in her sleep would see the man that she would marry and spend her life with.
The rock is there, but it's long since fallen over.
I believe it fell in 1906, and my understanding is that the churches began ringing their bells and declared that the devil had been driven out of Morgan County. Oh, if it could have only been true.
In 1876, a fire tore through downtown McConnellsville, burning an entire city block.
It was referred to as the Burn District. So for about 10 years, from 1879 until 1890, it sat vacant.
When the town apparently decided enough is enough, the village saw a great need for a town hall and an opera house.
At that time, the council was divided. Half of them wanted it, half of them didn't want this. And those that didn't want it were very conservative and considered this just a waste of resources. It went on for years whether or not to do this or not.
The progressive members of the village council saw their opportunity when a member of the opposition missed a council meeting.
Essentially, they waited for one of the members to leave, and so they knew they had a majority in the council chambers, and the mayor could break the tie. So, yeah, that's exactly what happened. They forced the vote at that time and passed it.
And so construction was started. But not to be outdone, back then, the symbol for the Republican Party was not an elephant, it was the owl. And so the Republicans had a big owl carved in the sandstone entryway. Didn't go over very well, but the owl, nevertheless, is still there.
A lot of the theaters of this time were second-floor auditoriums. Ours is unique in that way. You walk in off the street, and you're in our auditorium. The balcony was another unique feature. It's horseshoe-shaped. Many of them were just flat, straight across. The echo dome that is put in to help disperse the sound is another interesting feature.
With construction completed, a capacity crowd filed into the auditorium on opening night for a performance of Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. The stage was illuminated by electric lights, the first in Morgan County.
They got on stage and the performers were set to go and the lights faded. Yeah, half the people went home thinking, oh, great, here 2 years into this project and we've left, what, the epic failure, right? They had put in gas fixtures as a fail-safe because electricity was really deemed unreliable at that time. So what they did was use the gas fixtures and continued the production.
After a halting opening night, the Opera House thrived. Acts from across the country traveled to McConnellsville to perform on its stage.
Well, we were originally a vaudevillian theater in the early 1900s. That's when we started experimenting here with silent pictures. And into the 1930s is when they decided to make it primarily a movie house.
While the Opera House was under construction, the Muskingum was filled with traffic. By the mid-1800s, the wake of a paddle wheel and a puff of smoke rounding the bend were familiar sights for the residents of Morgan County. Many folks made their living on the river, and it attracted its fair share of characters, perhaps none more unique than Captain Isaac Hook.
Yeah, he was sort of widely recognized as a nut. I guess we've had our share of him.
Captain Hook began life on the river as a pilot at the age of 10, steering boats for his father's salt works near Hooksburg, a small community named for his family.
He was a very well-respected and widely known riverboat captain.
But a rough, gruff, typical keelboatman.
Over the course of his life, the captain fathered 16 children. Near the end, he set about building his tomb by the Brick Church Cemetery in Hooksburg. The shrine stands as a monument to the captain's unique view of the world.
He built it up high enough, he thought, to be above the floodwaters.
And then he is elevated because he said the Muskingum River will never, ever go beyond this level.
It's also famous for the fact that he built it with a rounded top because he did not want his wife to be able to dance on his grave.
There are stories about the man to indicate that he could also be aggravating and stubborn. Like the time he argued with his second wife and she became incensed. "I'll be glad to live to see the day they throw dirt on your coffin," she fumed. "I'll dance on it." "You'll never live to see that day," Hook shouted, and forthwith began to build his curved-top tomb. Actually, she preceded him in death. Ross Brown, Zanesville Times Recorder.
Adorning the top of Hook's tomb was a model sailing ship, allegedly placed by the captain so his soul could row away should floodwaters engulf his final resting place. The captain's concerns were not unfounded. The Muskingum River serves as the largest watershed in Ohio, covering nearly 20% of the state. Throughout history, it's been a fickle mistress to those living by its banks. Regular floods distributed much-needed nutrients to the fertile bottomlands, creating ideal conditions for planting crops. But as towns and homes encroached on the water's edge, the torrents wreaked havoc on the river's neighbors. In late March 1913, 4 days of torrential rainfall saturated the Midwest. As the waters reached Morgan County, the Muskingum's banks could not hold back the rising tide, and the river towns were baptized in the rushing current.
See, the pictures are pretty devastating. Wiped about everything out of business, you might say, in the area here.
In terms of property loss, it was incredibly devastating. It took out every bridge in the river valley. So in 1898, they had taken down the covered bridge and replaced it with a steel bridge. When that bridge was destroyed in 1913, we were really, really lucky that the bridge company had another one sitting in their bridge yard that was identical. Now, further down the river in Stockport, their bridge, of course, was also destroyed. It was replaced with a railroad bridge.
With their bridges gone and their towns in ruins, the citizens of Morgan County repurposed lumber from destroyed buildings and made ferries to cross the river. The brick church in Hooksburg was washed away in the waters. Captain Hook's model sailing ship has vanished as well. A federally funded project constructed dams along the Muskingum and its tributaries in an effort to calm the river's temper.
Now, we've had some floods that gets over the road on Route 60 here, but it's only a few feet deep and goes away pretty quick. We give it all to Marietta.
Feeding the Muskingum are many tributaries and creeks throughout Morgan County. In 1872, a young man named Howard Chandler Christie was born along Meigs Creek. He moved to Muskingum County early in his life and took an interest in art.
And he spent a lot of time drawing pictures and things from there, but then he went to New York City and got art lessons.
During the Spanish-American War, Christie traveled with the Army to Cuba. and captured the scenes of battle with his pen and ink. After returning from war, he began painting portraits and created the Christie Girl, his image of the ideal American woman. As the United States entered World War I, he painted posters for war bonds and other patriotic scenes. In 1921, he designed the trophy for the first Miss America pageant and served as the contest's only judge.
He painted murals on the walls of a lot of ladies, and unfortunately, they didn't have any clothes on.
The artwork for which he is most known is nudes, but you don't see those in places like McConnellsville very much. Here we have the Navy recruiting poster.
In the 1940s, Christie completed perhaps his most famous work, the signing of the Constitution, which hangs in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. His painting of the Treaty of Greenville hangs in the Ohio State House. While Christie traveled the globe, a yearly gathering known as Chautauqua brought performances, speeches, and musical acts from across the nation to the valley.
There was entertainment, there was music, there was magic, but a healthy dose of educational stuff. What it sort of reminds me of is like the prehistoric TED Talks. Communities would build a place to have the Chautauqua every year. We now call it the Commons or the Grove or the Park, but for many, many years it was called the Chautauqua Grounds. There was a huge wooden structure that was the Chautauqua Auditorium.
In addition to McConnellsville, the Chautauqua traveled throughout the valley, and the Union Hall in Chester Hill hosted the event on many occasions.
The Chautauqua was very important in the Union Hall. There were magicians, there were people who gave speeches, there were musical groups that performed. It was a very important part of the social life of that community and the education life.
They had foreign acts, they had local acts, and of course among all those local acts was one born, bred in Morgan County, McDonald Birch, the great magician.
As a young man in McConnellsville, McDonald Birch took an early interest in magic and soon hit the road performing magic for audiences across the country. While holding auditions for a new assistant, Mac met and fell in love with Mabel Sperry.
It was probably love at first sight. She not only got the job, but she got his heart. Mabel was a graduate of the Juilliard School of Music and could play any instrument and could put on a fabulous performance at the intermission time of their shows. And then she was always cut in half.
Mac and Mabel were soon performing the world over, and their popularity rivaled that of legends such as Houdini, Blackstone, and Mac's mentor, Thurston. Birch and Mabel made their home in Malta, and Mac frequently performed impromptu tricks for the crowds of children who followed him through the Twin Cities.
He would carry this little wand in his pocket, and he always knew that whenever he was downtown McConnellsville, and children, they'd rush up wide-eyed, and he never would hesitate to pull that little wand out and wave it and say butter and toast and pull a coin out from behind their ears. And I'd like to know, over the years, how many silver dollars Mac Birch gave away to children. And if they only knew today and had kept them, what a prize they would have.
Perhaps his most famous act was that of Princess, the vanishing pony.
Princess was one of his prized performances until one night at the M&M High School stage, Mac put on his full show. And Princess's time came, and the huge explosion went off, and Mac was already looking at the audience to take his formal bow. But the audience was screaming and laughing. And Mac literally had not a clue why. And suddenly Mac turned, and Princess's tail was still sticking out, swishing back and forth, and being the showman that he is, Mac simply turned back to the audience and he said, "Well, it shows what Prince's just made out of me. Now let's try this one more time." And this time, Princess was gone.
In 1990, McDonald Birch was awarded the Presidential Citation from the International Brotherhood of Magicians, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest in the history of magic. As Mac and Mabel performed around the world, Morgan County experienced an economic explosion as new coal mines were opened. Strip mines dotted the landscape, and massive machines tore through the earth, none larger than the Big Muskie. Weighing more than 12,000 tons and standing nearly 22 stories tall, the Big Muskie was the largest single-bucket digging machine ever constructed. The Big Muskie was taken out of service in the 1990s. But its 230-ton bucket remains as a tourist attraction at Miners Memorial Park. The bucket is just one of many monuments to Morgan County's past. In 1923, T.H. Simpson, a Detroit iron magnate originally from McConnellsville, erected 2 statues in the town, commemorating the county's contributions to the Civil War and World War I. Continuing this tradition, Doc and Sally Richmond funded a monument to Morgan County's namesake at the Kate Love Simpson Library.
People get the idea they named it after the Confederate. I said, would you really like to name your county after a Confederate? It's going to burn your house down and take your valuables. I just wanted maybe a statue showing it as General Daniel Morgan.
The Twin City Opera House has been in continuous operation since its doors opened in the 1890s.
Movies are our bread and butter, so we show movies every weekend. Every third Saturday for 13 years, we've been doing the Ohio Valley Opry, which is basically a scaled-down version of the Grand Ole Opry. We always try and get people in here to appreciate this venue and to appreciate what they have here.
The Morgan County Historical Society Museum operates in downtown McConnellsville and houses many artifacts from the county's past. The Historical Society also operates the Evelyn True Button House. Built in 1836, the Federal-style home offers an authentic glimpse into yesteryear. The Chester Hill Multicultural and Genealogical Center serves as a repository for the cultural history of southeastern Ohio. The organization makes its home in a former stop on the Underground Railroad.
We focus predominantly on Black history, but we cannot separate the Black history from the white history or indigenous people's history because we're all connected.
When you think of the word a melting pot, what do you think? Everything melted and mixed together, molded. No, we're like a tossed salad. Everybody brings a different flavor to the table, so to speak. So I'm a firm believer, in order to get love, you have to know who you are.
Morgan County is a special place to me. I mean, I was born and raised here. I have family that dates back to before McConnellsville or Malta were even established. And I think you will find that with a lot of the people that live here. They have deep roots here because they have great-great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers who established farms and built lives here.
To me, I think it's very important to know where, in fact, did your beginning start? What is your heritage?
But the pen of the poet can never portray 1/10 of the beauty possessed. By this miniature Hudson, smiling and gay, surely our people are blessed. The dear old Muskingum, we bear it today an almost idolatrous love. May its beauties and blessings continue alway, we beseech the kind Father above.
Support for our town, Morgan County, comes from the Citizens National Bank of McConnellsville, since 1886, working to support individuals, businesses, and charities while striving for economic and personal success in the community. Citizens National Bank, Morgan County's home-owned bank, member FDIC. Morgan County, Ohio, front porch to the great outdoors with rustic cabin hideaways, 30,000 acres of public access land for hunting, fishing, and camping. Events and attractions at visitmorgancountyohio.com. Additional support by the Morgan County Herald, connecting our community since 1844. Ohio Health, where health is an ongoing journey and wellness and sickness are part of a lifelong partnership. Discover your best health at Ohio Health. The Twin City Opera House, a Morgan County cultural landmark since 1892. Morris Hardware, in business since 1845 and operated by the same family for 6 generations in its original storefront in McConnellsville. And by the following.